Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Future of Food, the Wellness of Our Planet and Ourselves, hosted by the Georgetown University Alumni Association. I'm Allie Heel, the Associate Director of Alumni Career Services, and I'll be facilitating today's session. I'm thrilled to begin today's program by welcoming our speakers. Ricky Ashenfelter graduated from the McDonough School of Business in 2009 and is the CEO and co-founder of Spoiler Alert, a Boston-based VC-backed technology startup helping some of the world's leading food brands. Helvin Garvain graduated from the Walsh School of Foreign Service in 2021 after a 42-year hiatus from Georgetown and is the founder of Food Sector Systems, a startup research and advisory at the intersection of food security and national security. Dr. William Hahn is the director of the George Squared program, a collaboration between the Georgetown University Medical Center and George Mason University, and is the adjunct professor of biology and science, technology, and international affairs within the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Dr. Yuki Kato is an urban sociologist and assistant professor in the Department of Sociology within Georgetown College. Today's session is going to be moderated by Caroline Cotto, an alumna of Georgetown School of Nursing and Health Studies, class of 2014. Caroline is the co-founder and COO of Renewal Mill, a venture-backed startup upcycling the byproducts of food manufacturing into premium ingredients and delicious plant-based products. A food marketing and nutrition specialist, Caroline has experience at the UN World Food Program, the White House with Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative, Techstars Farm to Fork Accelerator, and HubSpot, where she ran the Women's Diversity Program globally. She grew up in food, working for her family's ice cream business in the town of Sandwich, Massachusetts. She serves as the inaugural board president of the Upcycled Food Association, and she formerly served as a Fulbright Fellow in Taiwan. In 2022, Caroline was named to Forbes 30 Under 40 and the 50 Best 50 Next list. For full biographies of each speaker, please reference the bio sheet located within the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. You may also use the questions section of your webinar control panel to submit questions throughout the session or to let me know if you're having any technical issues. Today's session is being recorded and we will share the recording via our follow-up email. Without further ado, I am pleased to turn things over to Caroline.
Thanks so much, Allie, and the Alumni Association for your warm introduction and for bringing us all together today. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with my fellow Hoyas and Georgetown professors to guide this conversation about issues that are so near and dear to my heart and so critical to each of us and our planet. So the topic today is the future of food, and there's hardly a more complex topic to try to fit into an hour-long discussion, but we're going to do our best. So each of us here offers a unique expertise and perspective on the food system. Today's will be a wide-ranging discussion, kind of scratching the surface on the critical issues we're confronting and what the future of food might look like. So we're going to explore how each of us on the panel are striving for change and seeing the impact of our work. And if we're successful, we hope to offer some insight and recommendations for the best path forward and to leave you all with a vision of what the future could look like for a more sustainable, healthy, and accessible food system in the months, years, and decades to come. So we've had amazing interest in today's discussion from our alumni community, over 315 of you joining us today. And we'll be covering some of the questions that you shared through your registration during our moderated time, as well as we'll have an opportunity later in the hour to respond to some live audience questions. So be sure to drop those in the chat. So with that, let's dive in. We're going to start at more of a systems level, talking about agriculture, or the way that we grow our food. So according to the Paris Climate Accords, in order to stabilize global warming at the target agreed upon, we need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by about 43% by 2030 and reach net zero in the 2050s. So I want to start with Bill. Can you kick us off and talk a little bit about how are we tracking towards these goals, and what is the role that our agricultural system is playing here?
Well, great. Well, first off, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It gives me great room for thought on a number of issues here that we'll be covering today. So in looking at tracking, the sad story is we're really not doing all that well. And, you know, we set targets for ourselves. We have to be very careful about what those targets really mean and what kind of commitments are needed to reach them. But we do have that twofold challenge of providing enough nutritious food equitably across the globe for an ever-growing population, at the same time really trying to rein in and reverse, in many cases, the environmental damage that we've wrought through our food system. And I think you hit it on the nose by saying food system, because that's how we have to look at it.
Awesome. And can you talk a little bit more about what the food and agricultural industry can do to bring us closer to that neutrality? Like, are there any particular projects that you can point to that are having meaningful impact as we look at transforming that system as a whole?
Sure. I think I noticed that one of the questions provided by the audience was referenced the Eat Lancet report, which looks at that duality of what is our diet, writ large. How do we look at our comprehensive diet, what we're eating, how much we're eating, where we're getting that food, and what kind of environmental impacts do different food production systems have on collectively. So I think that if we're looking at what can be done, we need to look introspectively, but we also have to look at how policy is made. The Farm Bill is coming up next year, so now's a really good time to be weighing in on these issues. We need to just consider what the farmers are facing, what the industry and the entire supply chain is facing. All of these things need to be addressed, and there are certain points that have bigger impact. I know that we'll get to it, but red meat reduction is a big one and a very controversial one. But those are the kinds of things we need to be looking at across the entire life cycle. Where are the big impacts and how can we address those collectively?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess I would like to skip ahead to the meat discussion real quick. So I know it's a hot topic, and we've also received some audience questions about that. But yeah, we all kind of know the general sentiment that we should be reducing our meat consumption, but curious to get your thoughts on how plant-based meats compare to traditional animal agriculture and where you think the plant-based trend is going, just especially given some recent data out about kind of stagnant market adoption.
Sure. Yeah, there's been some challenges on that front. It's the kind of thing where education is of paramount importance. If, for instance, our elementary schools had more plant-based protein in the diet served, you just become accustomed to it, and it's second nature. You're not served a big hamburger as a kindergartner. At the home, educating people at the household level. How is our proteins displayed in the supermarkets or on a menu? Often a menu has vegetarian options as the last option. So little things like that can make a huge impact if we approach them collectively.
Yeah, no, totally. I think behavior change is super interesting when it comes to food and to looking at the system collectively. So, I mean, the small tweaks that companies can do, but I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about consumer demands and how that's affecting both what ends up on the menu and also like sustainable farming practices at large.
Great. So I think it's pretty well received that there are nutritional benefits to adopting a more plant-based protein diet. And we can see that to some degree on the labels that are provided to us. But there is virtually nothing on a label that gives us a sense of the environmental impact of what's in the container, in the can, or in the box. So getting some kind of an environmental impact statement, to use the term, on a box of or a can of food will inform the consumer. And if you were to see what a plant-based protein production system relies upon in terms of water use, fertilizer use, land use, et cetera, and compare that with the animal-based protein, especially red meat sources, and start to make the comparisons and make the connections, that might have an impact, but there's several dots to be connected there, and it just requires a tremendous amount of education. Subsidies, we spend a lot of money on red meat at the federal taxpayer dollar level, and that's just something that has to be addressed. Any number of other points along the process there that need to be addressed.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned putting labeling on package for for environmental concerns. I think at my heart, I'd love to believe that that would actually affect consumer behavior, but I think there's a skeptic in me that believes that people are not necessarily willing to put their money there if it means a higher price point. And I think we've also seen a similar thing with different labels and consumers not really understanding them. Like one that comes to mind is non-GMO. And so wondering if you might be able to talk about, I think like consumers kind of generally think that non-GMO means healthier, but wondering if you might be able to talk a bit about non-GMOs and just labeling in general and for consumers.
Okay, great. So the USDA just came out with a new system for labeling what is referred to as bioengineered food. They opted against using GMO because of the negative connotations of that term and the misinterpretations of what that actually means. There are lots of different technologies involved in genetically modifying organisms that end up or could end up on our plate. That's something which is often lost in the conversation. So the USDA opted for a more generic bioengineered a genetically engineered label, which unfortunately is not well defined. So even if you saw the label and the way it's implemented, so for example, there are lots of exceptions to what needs to be labeled in terms of the percentage content of GMO material, et cetera, and you can actually opt out by just putting a QR code on the box. No one is going to walk down the aisle with their phone scanning every single can to see what's in the container. I get it. The problem is that we have a society in which certifications proliferate and only a handful have any meaning behind them. I will say that the USDA certified organic label means something, and that has tremendous value, but a good number of the others that are on your can, such as non-GMO, they don't necessarily mean that much. There are too many ambiguities in terms of how they're derived and how they're actually certified. So yes, I agree. Labeling alone isn't going to solve the problem, but we have to use a lot of different tools to educate, and that could be one of those tools.
Gotcha. And I guess outside of bioengineered or non-GMOs, are there any other technologies or advances that you're personally really interested in that you think are kind of transforming the agricultural system as we look towards kind of reducing greenhouse gases?
For sure, there's a tremendous amount of technology that's involved in information technology that's being implemented. Precision delivery of fertilizer and water, using drones and GPS systems and aerial surveillance of that sort to know exactly where the water needs to go and exactly where the fertilizer needs to go, rather than just spraying the entire field. Electricity on the farm. A farmer has one big asset, and that's land. And they'll use it for whatever purpose best suits their interests and their financial goals. But if you have land, you can capture photons, and putting solar panels out and charging vehicles, your tractors, your trucks, everything else can be electrified, leaving us far less dependent upon diesel for the most part. So electrifying the farm fleet is another area where there's potential for adopting technology in the food production system at the farm level.
Gotcha. So if you had to say, what's the biggest bang for our buck as far as doubling down on the agricultural system and reducing greenhouse gases, where would you invest dollars today?
Well, it's looking at soil management, and it's looking at the fact that we need to stop deforesting. The one natural system that captures carbon is photosynthesis. And what we're doing is removing that by deforesting or converting landscapes into other purposes. So anything we can do to reduce deforestation and agricultural land expansion and get more out of what we're actually already using, and in particular managing the soils for carbon, is among the areas where we can get the biggest bang for the buck. This is not to exclude other components of the system. Reducing waste, improving the manufacture of inputs, precision delivery is certainly a big one, but managing soil and precision delivery, I would say, are two of the real big ones.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bill. And you're teeing us up perfectly to move over and chat a little bit with Ricky here about waste reduction. So after we spend all of this energy and money growing our food, only about 30% of the food that we grow actually makes it to people's plates, which is still kind of a shocking number to me. But that wasted food accounts for, at least according to a lot of estimates, about 8% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So Ricky, you work on with some of the world's leading food brands like Kraft Heinz, Nestle, Mondelez, and Danone, and help them manage their excess inventory and mitigate food waste through your startup, Spoiler Alert. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how Spoiler Alert came to be and some of the work that you're doing to tackle waste in the system.
Sure. Thanks for having us, Caroline. As you noted, we're a technology startup that works with food manufacturers on excess and short-dated inventory. And in the food industry, manufacturers certainly aren't perfect at predicting consumer demand. And because of that, they're often rendered with too much inventory. And what we also see is retailers have pretty strict requirements about how much shelf life product must have before it's even shipped into their grocery stores. And what happens is manufacturers often are faced with that hard decision to write this inventory off and clear out space in their warehouses to make room for the next batch of food. So what we do all day, every day is working with manufacturers to get ahead of this problem and take action on excess and aging inventory before having to resort to disposal. And how we do that is providing tooling, pricing intelligence, and ultimately networking capabilities for them to take a more digital approach to discounting and donating excess inventory and tapping into a national network of discount retailers and nonprofits that are focused on affordable food nutrition, food access, often in underserved communities with consumers that are priced out of traditional grocery. You asked how it came to be. My co-founder and I started ideating around this problem close to a decade ago, a few years after graduating from Georgetown and then being in business school at MIT up in Boston. And fast forward 7, 8, 9 years, we're having a lot of fun working with some really great brands and backed by some great food and technology investors. And through all that, we're proud to announce that we've closed. We've helped our suppliers sell more than $350 million of excess inventory and keep close to 600 million pounds of product out of landfills.
That's amazing. Congrats on all of that work. Curious, corporations of the size that you're working with are not historically known for rapidly adopting new technologies. So curious how they taken on your solution or other food waste technology solutions, and do you think that industry is kind of ahead of policy or vice versa? Are they adapting to policy demands?
Good question. When it comes to the food waste problem, certainly a lot of different solutions needed at different parts of the food system. I would say where we spend most of our time thinking about is on the waste prevention side. So the notion of not generating food waste or wasted food in the first place. I'd say at the manufacturing level, we're seeing companies start to invest in solutions that help them do demand planning better. And we've seen wider adoption of those types of technologies in the last decade. Others, the space we play in, which is around sort of dynamic discounting of excess inventory. At the retail level, I'd say that's where we've seen a lot of innovation and a lot more adoption, particularly in the last 5 years. And retailers are taking quite a bit of a different approach, in part because they have direct access to all of us as consumers. So I'd say in the retail space, they're adopting often a new wave of technology that's helping them do demand planning better, not over order. We're seeing more adoption of what's called shelf life extension technology, which is adding days or weeks of extra freshness to products like produce and protein, so that they can stay fresher for longer. And then we're seeing other retailers leveraging consumer discounting strategies that are intended to give consumers the option to pay a little bit less for product that has a little bit less shelf life or is a little bit closer to expiration date. I think the second part of your question was around policy. And I'd say, policies having different impacts on different parts of the food system. I think at the manufacturing level, perhaps what's been most impactful in the past decade has been greater alignment around date labeling standards and clarifying what it means to use terms like use by or best if used by, which have historically caused a lot of confusion for consumers about what is and isn't safe to eat and what's an indicator of quality, not safeness. I'd say the other categories that we see a lot of legislative focus on is more at the state and local level around waste that isn't prevented, but ultimately wants to be recycled. So, we're seeing more and more legislation around organics recycling mandates, so that certain generators of certain amount of organic waste are required to send that somewhere other than landfills. We're seeing a lot of funding going to building out anaerobic digesters to turn food scraps into energy. And then the area we're probably biggest fans of is greater tax incentives to get businesses to donate products in larger quantities to local nonprofits.
Super interesting. Yeah, I think the date labeling piece is super intriguing to me. I know the UK has recently been doing a lot of policy and legislation work to get date labeling removed from some products because people are so trained to just, like, once it becomes Best Buy, throw it out when it might have even weeks left on shelf life and still be safe. So it kind of speaks to the point that we can do a lot at the kind of corporate level where both you and I are working in manufacturing and kind of upstream, but a significant portion of food waste is still happening at the household level with individual consumers. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, having been in the space a while, what would you say that consumers can be doing to help fight food waste in their own homes?
So many things that consumers can be doing, from better meal planning and grocery purchasing to residential composting and whatnot. I would say maybe through the lens of embracing some of the emerging trends, my call to action to consumers would be show retailers and manufacturers that you have a willingness to pay for products and services that are intended to address the food waste problem. So two tactical recommendations on that front. The first would be, next time you're at Whole Foods or your local grocery store, buy the products that are made from upcycled foods or otherwise wasted ingredients. Swap in a bag of renewal mill flour instead of your conventional store brand. And what that does is it sends signals to retailers that you as consumers want these products. And it also has the effect of helping these emerging brands win over more shelf space in the long run. I'd say the second recommendation to the consumers is start actually shopping at these discount retailers that are merchandising excess and wonky inventory at more affordable prices. There's a ton of options on this front now that didn't exist 5-10 years ago. That could be leveraging platforms like Misfits Market for grocery delivery as an alternative to some of the larger e-commerce providers. That could be solutions like Flash Food or Too Good To Go that let you pay less for foods that have fewer days of shelf life remaining, or simply shop at your local brick and mortar discount grocery store that carries more unique flavors or packaging sizes, or simply products that have less shelf life remaining. I think all of these types of actions can go a long way in forcing greater product availability for consumers and greater innovation expectations for retailers and manufacturers.
Thanks, Ricky. I think that's great advice. And I think it's such a silly problem that we have such a massive food waste issue when 10% of the world is going hungry, which is going to lead us into our next topic here on food justice. Yuki, as an urban sociologist in recent years, you've researched some major world events like disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic and their impact on food and environmental justice. So from some of your work has explored how the growth of urban farming has been affected in post-Katrina New Orleans, as well as the urban agricultural impacts of COVID-19 in DC. So would love you to tell us a little bit more about this research.
Sure, thank you. So I have become a researcher of urban agriculture by chance. I'm trained as an urban sociologist. So, from the beginning, it was not an area that I was familiar with. So I certainly had to read up quite a bit before I came across this scholarship of environmental justice and food justice. And that's been really guiding how I think about food systems, as Bill pointed out earlier, and then also to understand the role that the urban agriculture can and has been playing, and where it might be going, I think, as a part of this conversation in the future. So in New Orleans, I was doing research on the emergence of urban farming in the city as it was, transitioning from a post-disaster recovery to really rapid gentrification in a matter of a decade. So it was a context of very, quickly changing city, and to understand who was doing the work, how, and what became of those spaces as the city really started to kind of reinvent itself economically and socially, and also that having impact on sort of a culture and social relationships within certain neighborhood that was transitioning very quickly. And then in terms of COVID's impact, I wanted to understand how the potential of urban agriculture as a way to rise to the occasion, especially many of us may remember both being at the grocery store, with faced by empty shelves or long lines of cars and individuals trying to get some food access at food banks, and during the earlier months of the pandemic. And so we wanted to understand, what is the potential of community gardens or school gardens or urban farms in the city to be able to address these kind of specifically localized food insecurity. And then more recently, I've been looking at the land and resource access for urban farmers in DC. As the city goes through very rapid gentrification, what does it really mean for us to support and promote urban agriculture in a city that is increasingly, losing, affordable spaces to do so? So that's really the kind of range of research that I do.
And what have been some of the key takeaways? Are we seeing more urban agriculture?
It's both optimistic and troubling, I think, to me. On one hand, when I speak about the work that I do on topics of gentrification, the backdrops of that, but on urban agriculture, most everyone's, sort of eyes light up, and I haven't really come across anybody that says, I hate urban agriculture or gardening. Most everybody seems to like the idea of urban gardening. Yet, when it comes to really understanding what it takes to sustain, especially urban farm in a city that is gentrifying, it's really something that most public does not really understand the difficulty of making it work. And some of the challenges that, Bill pointed out in rural, larger scale ag actually does still also apply in terms of the labor and, climate change. All those things are also affecting urban farmers. But in terms of actually putting the money, right, and resources behind that general enthusiasm towards urban ag, I think is really lacking in a lot of cities. And but I think it's also troubling for me to also see this new wave of urban agriculture being marketed and understood as a new phenomena, when in fact, at least in the United States, and actually really most parts of the world, folks have always been growing food in a city, but those activities tended to happen in marginalized community, be it immigrant community, Black communities, working class communities. Those folks actually have always been growing food for themselves, often because they had know how to do so, whether it's because of their backgrounds in immigration, maybe they came from very agricultural backgrounds, or that they were forced into labor as a part of the Southern plantation agriculture industry in earlier part of this country's founding. And so, there were means that people actually were utilizing and be able to feed themselves, their family, and their community. And we never really called that urban ag, but those were really available, were prominent ways that people were sustaining what in food justice scholarship we call food sovereignty, right? So it's not just food access, but it's a capacity to be able to determine where one's food comes from, what kind of food one is able to access, and how you're going to actually sort of oversee the process of use of the land for how food is being produced. And so the communities having those capacity to feed themselves, especially in the context of their structural economic marginalization that almost forced them to do so, but also them being able to do this was a very important part of their kind of a social and community structure. And I find it ironic that in a city like DC, for example, gentrification will be the first to, these individuals and these communities will be the first to be displaced with the gentrification, incoming of wealthier development and even food access, right? I know that in the edited volume that I co-edited on food and gentrification called Recipe for Gentrification, we show that food establishments are one of the first signs of neighborhood turning over. Increasingly, Whole Foods or Trader Joe's opening is a very telltale sign that neighborhood has or is about to turn over. And so as the city and neighborhoods begin to see more opportunities and more access to quote unquote better food, folks who actually used to exercise their capacity to feed themselves are losing land, losing access, losing their community ties, and no longer able to, and therefore have to then rely on, food pantries or food banks or, other forms of government or private assistance. And so I feel that, not recognizing how central these kind of communal food provisioning at the local level had been. And in my next work, I would love to be able to shed light on those, historical and ongoing activities at the grassroots level.
Super interesting. Yeah, I know we've seen this kind of gentrification in food in neighborhoods like the H Street neighborhood in DC with, Whole Foods popping up there and impacting that. But curious, Kelvin, turning over to you a bit about how public policy is impacting food justice and food security in your city in Los Angeles and more broadly across the US.
Thank you for facilitating this event, and thank everyone else who is participating. I think that one thing that is really clear is public policy being implemented by people on the local level, and that's often articulated by food policy councils. So there are a number of different mechanisms to create private and public partnerships, and also to influence who you might have voted in, either on your council or your ward level, or definitely your mayor, governor, but definitely the food policy councils is a mechanism. Looking at what Ricky was talking about in terms of legislation here in Los Angeles and throughout the state, Senate Bill 1383. This is something which is really mandating the actual movement of food, diverting food from landfills and making sure that it's donated. So what they call tier 1 food generators, which are generally retail markets, having relationships so that instead of throwing away food that for whatever reason they're throwing it away, getting it to some of the nonprofits, the food recovery organizations. The bill we have here, 954, is labeling. And as has already been stated, it can be really tricky. Federally, it's not clear. So every state doesn't have labeling for dairy products or fish and seafood, poultry products, meat products. And I've even seen it in my volunteer work on the local level at food recovery organizations, where there are people who are coming looking for food, and they'll look at a label and they'll say, oh no, this date, and it's from Whole Food, it's from, Trader Joe's, it's from what we have out here, that's sort of like Safeway, Ralph's, and people who are looking for food, they say no, and they look at the date. So now donated food, donated in good faith, people are looking at it at the local street level where they need a meal later that day, and they're saying, no, this label doesn't sound right. On a whole nother household level, sometimes my own wife will say, oh, it's been in the refrigerator for a couple of days, I think we should just throw it out. And I'm the guy who says, whoa, wait a minute, we can still eat that. And then it becomes a conversation. Well, how do we know? Let's smell it. You can taste it. And this is something which awareness, education, and outreach, having organizations like the food recovery organizations understand what the bill is. So the bill says you can have a relationship with a tier 1 food generator, and that relationship will enable you to have more food. Then the other piece is, well, if I get food as a food recovery organization, is that food edible? And if it's not edible, what do I do with it? Well, compost it. Perhaps use it for the landscape in front of your facility, or perhaps in the neighborhood. So a lot of people aren't aware of that. And in urban environments, there's a lot, especially in Los Angeles, there's a lot of land that cannot be activated for anything because it has lead, arsenic, and other heavy metals. So you're in a situation where people might pass by a lot on a certain street and say, we should put a garden there, there should be a farm there. But in actuality, you can't do that. When we talk about gentrification, there's also a gentrification of generations. I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in a time when Shirley Chisholm was voted in and represented us. My family came from North and South Carolina. We grew things in the backyard. They worked. This was part of the culture. This was part of how we breathed. So there are a lot of young people that don't want to grow anything. They don't want to ruin their acrylics. They don't want to, they don't want to be in a situation where they're outside in the dirt. Older people, my back, my knee, my rheumatoid arthritis, they're not looking to grow anything. They might have to have raised beds as opposed to shovel to soil agriculture. Here in Los Angeles, we have the Urban Agriculture Incentive Zone Act. A lot of people don't know about it. A lot of people don't know how to activate it. So there's an enormous amount of, as was mentioned in the beginning, awareness and education and outreach that's important. And there's also a lot on the local level and on the household level to become involved with things like food policy councils. And you don't have to be, a Georgetown grad or an MIT grad to be a part of a food policy council or a sustainability council in your neighborhood. And most neighborhoods do have neighborhood councils. And you don't have to be someone who's seen this webinar to go into your supermarket and ask them, what do you do with your excess food? What do you do with the fish that's here in the salmon area that isn't being sold? So we vote with what we buy, and we can do a number of different things at the market and in our home to alleviate and to change policy.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Just getting involved is important to being able to command authority in your local food justice movement. But curious, with your startup Food Sector Systems, maybe you could just tell us about one of the projects quickly that you're working on.
Well, I'm trying to get a food recovery organization to realize that composting is important. And one of the things that they hadn't been doing was, one, creating a supply chain where, because they don't have capacity with transportation, to get donations from places that are closer to them. Then the other piece is if you get food from a donor and it's not edible, instead of throwing it away, finding ways to compost it. Now, one of the things that I've gotten them to do is literally take it to a local community garden. The other thing is begin composting it so it can be used to regenerate the soil around their facility, because around their facility is laden with lead and arsenic. And an easy thing is I speak Spanish, and so many people do not speak English in parts of Los Angeles, and to be able to interface with individuals in their own language, it really builds a bridge, and it creates a different level of dignity, where someone might have to sign what their zip code is, but in their name and how many people are in their household, and they can't write their name. And with me being able to develop rapport, I can speak to them in Spanish and say, podemos escribir su nombre juntos. We can write your name together. So helping people understand legislation, helping people understand how to activate legislation, and also how to activate funding for things like composting is something which I'm working to do aggressively throughout the city.
I love that. Yeah, it's really embodying the Georgetown, men and women for others mentality there. And so kind of would love to talk to each of you a bit about your connection to Georgetown. So sort of Bill and Yuki, in your time teaching at Georgetown, how have your experiences been with students? Have you seen a growing interest and passion in food over the last few years? Maybe starting with Bill.
Oh, for sure. I've been at Georgetown about 20 years, and increasingly there's an interest there. It's such a natural, there's a certain foodie mentality among many of the students. They want to connect to their local environment. They want to connect to their food sources. New courses popping up all the time. I'll just shout out the Earth Commons effort right now for the Hoya Harvest, which is developing a on-campus farm/garden and using that as an exploratory tool. By all means, there's increased interest.
And Yuki?
I agree with that. Also, I teach a course once a year called a seminar called Environmental Justice and Food Justice Movement. It's a mouthful, and it's typically taught as a community-based learning, and so it's extra 30 hours of volunteer work is expected. So, but every year that course fills up, up to 20, 25 students. And so I know that there's a very strong interest among the students, and I don't think we actually have quite enough number of faculty on campus right now, particularly to address the kind of issue that I think the students are interested in, or at least the sort of a social component of the environmental issues, and in particular when it comes to, I think, food issues, there's not as many of us who do the work as a sort of a central part of our research. And so I do feel that the sort of a desire and need from the students. That being said, I do feel also often that the students, when they first come to my classes, are typically coming from kind of a mainstream environmental movement or kind of alternative food, like Bill mentioned, foodies perspectives. And so my job as a sociologist have always been to get them to think about aspect of food that perhaps they haven't really thought about. What about labor? What about land injustice? Or what about cultural component aspect of why we eat what we eat? And then also in particular, because a lot of the Georgetown students are very eager to help others, which is great. But I also strongly advise the students to think about what has already been in existence in these communities that they may want to go and help, to see what kind of system has, have already been in existence, system or, efforts to make sure that they're not trying to override or, become the sort of a gentrifier of the movement itself, but to actually work alongside, just as Kelvin was pointed out. There's a lot that I think, college educated folks can bring to elevate and strengthen the existing movement rather than to compete with them. So that's one of the strong, sort of a strong message that I try to always send.
Yeah, how to be additive, super interesting. I think I'm always shocked by how many Hoyas ended up working in food in some capacity, despite there being sort of a tracker focus. Like some of the largest food companies, as far as like Sweet Green or Halo Top, have all come out of Georgetown founders. So Ricky and Kelvin, curious how Georgetown impacted your interest in and trajectory towards the work you're doing now. Starting with Ricky, maybe.
Sure. So I came into Georgetown deeply passionate about sustainability and how sort of the private sector could solve some of the world's largest environmental problems. And I think I really was attracted to the community and the curriculum that really let me lean into that at Georgetown, and in part through that global impact angle and really embodied by the Jesuit values, but also a comprehensive business and policy curriculum that sat squarely between private and public sector innovation around climate initiatives. I'd say when I came to campus some 17 years ago, I remember at that time having to make the case to one of the deans to let me pair an environmental studies minor with a finance major. And I think I was told I had been the first McDonough undergrad to attempt to do that at that time. And now you fast forward 2 decades, and it's just so great to see how far the institution has come, not only through the environmental initiative that Bill and Yuki mentioned, but also the advancements in the entrepreneurship program out of McDonough as well, and all the great startups and innovations that have emerged as well.
And Kelvin?
I'm going to have to do a lot of fast forwarding. When I grew up in Brooklyn, we saw the UN towers, and I thought that if you went in there, you'd go to the different countries. And somehow I got dialed into wanting to be like Ralph Bunche. I wanted to be an ambassador. And I had this idea that if I went to Georgetown, if I went to the School of Foreign Service, after 4 years, I would get my portfolio and have the stylish glasses and suits that he had. I really started studying development economics and looking at the countries which now have emerged, but back then were considered basket cases without the possibility of having any real development. African development. I studied Arabic at the time as well. Fast forward to working with the Marine Corps, helping them learn culture and language before going to Iraq and Afghanistan. I saw that humanitarian affairs were very deeply involved with full spectrum warfare and stability operations. Coming to Los Angeles, I see that what is happening with people in the street, people living in tents like they lived when I was a kid and the United Way would have ads. These are people in India. Now they're here in Los Angeles and across America. And I see we're facing a humanitarian crisis. So food, the intersection of public safety and public health. If you have a toxic stress environment, then you will emit more cortisol and you won't want any of the great food that is available any place in America. If you now are in a climate crisis area, you can't grow food anymore. Your land has been submerged or you've been inundated by locusts. So what gives me urgency, a real urgency about this, is this humanitarian crisis related to food and realizing there are inefficiencies in how to move the abundance of food and inefficiencies in how to use the resources that we have more wisely so we can live like Georgetown's value, caring for our common home. How we can live in that way is very important to me. And things like the Earth Commons is amazing. This is new. This new value of care for our common home. This is a new value at Georgetown, and it's remarkable and it's refreshing. And I'm glad that my relationship has spanned over 40 years.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I can speak to my personal experience too. I think I spent a lot of time in undergrad trying to understand food from like a nutrition perspective and health perspective. And then as I've started my company in later years, the Alumni Association and Entrepreneurship Program has been absolutely instrumental to supporting that work. So I know we're all very grateful for Georgetown across our work. But I think we're going to now jump over to some audience questions in the last 10 minutes we have here. So if anyone has any questions that have come up for any of the panelists, please drop them into the chat. But we did have a few questions pre-submitted. So one question, and anybody feel free to answer, but one question that was asked was, what is the relationship between sustainable practices and marketing practices? So how can companies that truly care about using quality ingredients compete against industry big names and fake healthy marketing? So I don't know who wants to kick us off, but would love some thoughts on marketing as it relates to sustainability.
Sounds like a Ricky question.
I can take a stab at that, which is, certainly I think, consumers send this clearest signal of where they spend their money and the purchasing power. So the more truly clean, green, sustainable products on the market, I think rises all tides. I think there's probably some maybe ill thoughts around like big food in America, but I think one of the best ways to transition the bigger companies that have either processed or ultra processed foods is changing from within, and then also them acquiring. We're seeing the bigger companies acquiring more and more of these emerging sustainable brands and using that to sort of innovate from within. You see Unilever as a great example. They've acquired some great brands like Sir Kensington's and Ben & Jerry's, and that, I think, culture has been infused throughout the whole company. So I think ultimately you need sort of big and small brands to feed the world, but they serve different roles.
I'd like to add that we are now, I think, at a very important inflection point, and frontline workers, and those are generally people who are women, immigrants, Black, Hispanic, poor, if you will, European descendants, and what we are going to eat so that we can thrive, so that we can be resistant to a public health system which might not work, or a public safety system which might not work. It is at a point where if you're smoking menthol cigarettes, which are pointedly marketed toward African Americans, I think if you're concerned about COVID, you might want to stop smoking menthol. You might want to begin looking at your diet so that then you can begin to be self-sustaining in terms of not being susceptible, which is to things like COVID-19 or other viruses that are going to become more persistent and more pervasive in our society. So regardless of what they tell me about the Happy Meal or some of these other products, I really have to become more aware and understand, how am I going to really be fortified? How am I going to eat to live? So the sustainability, I think, again, comes to the household. And again, neighborhoods where there is high stress, toxic stress, where people crave high sugar and high fat content food. I think that there's a real awakening that has to take place right now, so that the marketing means nothing.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, we have another question. Bill, I think there's a question. We talked a little bit about plant-based meat, but there's some conversation around the impact of lab-grown meat and how that differs, and whether or not that's more sustainable than traditional meat sources. So curious if you have any thoughts on that.
So it's a very young industry. The first lab-grown meat for consumption has just been approved in the US. It's chicken cell meat. It's been approved in Singapore for a while. You have to realize that you're in a building and you're controlling the environment. You can be very efficient with your use of inputs, but they still have inputs, and everything has to be brought in: the electricity, the lighting, the temperature control, the water, the nutrients, everything. Whereas a lot of our, if you will, naturally produced food draws upon naturally provided inputs. Most food is grown with rainfall, not irrigation. Most food makes some significant use of soil fertility. Most food draws on sunlight directly rather than some artificial lighting. So the issue is, how efficient can the system be, and will that compensate for the use of artificial inputs, I'll just use that term, as opposed to natural inputs like direct sunlight and direct rainfall. The jury's still out, but it does provide an opportunity to very tightly control the production of food. And that could be a lifesaver in certain parts of the world or certain times of the year, or under different situations of duress or shortages.
Gotcha. So another question we have here is on food prices and global hunger are on the rise due to the Ukraine war, COVID, and climate change impacts. So in 2021, hunger surpassed all previous records with close to 193 million people being acutely food insecure. So Yuki, I'm curious, what do you believe is the most impactful action towards solving the issue of food insecurity, or one?
Oh boy, that's a $1 million question, isn't it? I think what Ricky pointed to in terms of kind of looking at it both at the macro and micro level solutions, I think it's very important. And I think very often, particularly the kind of conversation that is brought into my class is alternative, right? So like go to farmers market and do CSAs and even grow your own food, and that's all just one aspect. But I think oftentimes then what happens is that only some of us are able to afford that kind of a privileged way of accessing food, leaving out large number of people who actually were already food insecure before, conditions actually turned to the worst. And so I do think that, not necessarily just saying, oh, I don't go to, grocery stores anymore, which is good for you, but, what about the rest of us? And so I do think that, tackling the issues that are at the larger scale, of food systems, whether it's all the way from the global food chain to micro level food chains. And one of the things that we discovered during COVID was that yes, there was a sort of expanding demand for the urban and sort of like peri-urban small scale farmers, but most of that demand came from people who otherwise would have shopped at Whole Foods, right? And so is that really good change? Is that, problematic? Like that's really the conversation that I think we need to have, instead of saying that if we all could just go to farmers market, then we're going to help, solve all the problems. That's just not really pragmatic, but also I think it leaves out, very important ways of thinking about how globally connected all the food system is right now. And so there is a level of efficiency that we need to take into consideration in terms of, affordability and all those things. But at the same time, all of that with an understanding of how culturally important food is, right? So like when it comes to artificial meat, some people just won't, no matter how healthy and environmentally sustainable it is, or it's going to take a long time, right, for somebody to be open. And so I think understanding all those becomes very important in moving the needle forward.
Caroline, I'd like to add that how long has the conflict in Ukraine been going on? We've been having issues with hunger for many more years prior to the conflict in Ukraine. I think that climate, where you can grow food and where there is water, I think that is extremely critical. I was talking to someone in Uganda who was talking about locusts. What's happening in Lake Chad, Congo River, what's happening here with, the water supply in Los Angeles and throughout California. So I think that climate, where you can actually live and where you can actually grow food, is going to be just as challenging as conflict. A third of Pakistan is underwater right now. Those people aren't farming.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And we've only scratched the surface here today of all the issues going on in our food system. But I want to close by asking each of you, in 20 seconds or less, can you share with us what is the future of food? Where are we headed, and where should we be headed? Just if you had to leave the audience with one thought. Ricky, maybe we'll start with you.
I think it's just we have more options than we've ever had as a nation. So vote with your dollars, consume products and services that send signals that you value sustainability and environmental improvement.
Kelvin?
I think that the future food is local, and I think that the future food is intentional. What you buy is a signal to what is available to you, and what you are aware of that is going to enable you to thrive, to live. Eating to live is going to be critical. And for me, I think that food in general should be optimal, meaning the best food for any age that you are, and it should be available, accessible, affordable, and acceptable.
Great. Bill?
I'd echo those. I think the key is to be, as Kelvin said, intentional. Look at your plate and think, am I really eating all this? Have I made the wisest decisions about what I'm eating? Not just the specifics on your plate, but where you bought it and what dietary choices you made. And then scale up to see what are you purchasing? What are you, how are you purchasing? I think you just have to think about the whole system very comprehensively. And if we do so, I think that the world is going to be a much better place.
And lastly, Yuki?
I'd like food to be the sort of a focal point for addressing a lot of different issues, because we all touched upon so many different issues, and oftentimes, you know, not for many of us who are here today, but I think so often food is kind of an afterthought or its own sort of a, you know, idea. And in order to fix food system, as we all have said, we have to fix so many other things. And so I would love food to become a much more centralized and kind of a focal point for all of us to think about, you know, how to fix so many other issues.
Fantastic. So Ricky, Kelvin, Bill, and Yuki, thank you all so much for taking the time to share your insights and expertise with our alumni community. And to all of our listeners, thank you all for joining the conversation on the future of food today. There will be a recording made available, and Hoya Saxa, and thanks. Have a great rest of your day.
We are Georgetown. Hoya Saxa.